This is my naked deck, and today we're gonna give it some clothes. But decks don't wear clothes, they wear decking boards. So in this video, I'm gonna show you how to install composite decking from start to finish. And I'm not gatekeeping anything. I'm gonna share with you all of my secrets, all my tips, all my tricks, so that you can get a professional looking result while saving a ton of money by installing it yourself. Thanks to Lowe's for sponsoring the video, and let's get into it. Obviously, for this project, we're gonna need some materials. And although you can head over to Lowe's to grab everything, composite decking boards are big, heavy, and a bit unruly, so instead of trying to manhandle them in the store to prove to yourself that you still got it, I recommend doing some online shopping on Lowes.com and having all your materials delivered to the site.
Trust me, it's hard enough getting the boards from the driveway to the deck.
And if you're still trying to decide if you want to go with composite decking, let me give you a quick overview. As you can see from this table I put together, composite decking dominates traditional wood decking in every single category except initial cost. I'm going to talk more about cost in the middle of the video, so stick around.
But before we can start talking about the composite decking, we got to talk about framing.
The maximum joist spacing for most composite decking is 16-inch on center, but 12-inch on center is sometimes needed if you're going to be installing your decking at an angle. Additionally, you want to think about your decking when you're framing your deck to make sure that you put blocking and supports in where it's going to be needed. This will make more sense in a minute.
Now you might be tempted to start putting a bunch of boards down and then screwing them in place. But if you do that, you'll be left with this super amateur looking finish on the edge.
To solve this problem, we're going to be using a technique called picture framing, where we create a perimeter of boards around the deck. I'm going to install my first picture frame board right here.
And we're going to install it along the edge after a little bit of funny business to get around these supports.
And now is probably a good time to mention that composite boards come in two main edge profiles. Grooved edge boards are designed for hidden fasteners and give your deck a seamless look, and square edge boards are perfect for picture framing, so that's what we're going to use for all of our perimeter boards.
And that's going to give us a nice clean edge that's a lot more visually appealing.
And lastly, I like to leave around a 1-inch overhang for the picture frame boards, and this just gives me the option to go back later on and put some skirting underneath the deck and still have it be concealed from the top by that picture frame board. And I'm using color matched composite screws that I got from Lowe's, and I'll link all these Lowe's products down below. And I don't put the screws all the way in right now, and you'll see why in a minute. And with the first picture frame board installed, it's time for the first row of decking boards starting at the house.
All right, we're getting to the point where we can start installing the boards here that go perpendicular to the joists. But before I put this in place, I'm gonna snap a quick chalk line to make sure that I have a straight run of boards all the way across and that I don't get off kilter. Because these boards are around 5.5 inches, I think I'm gonna go 5 3/4 inch away from the ledger board here. That way there's a little bit of a gap for water and everything to drain. I don't wanna push it all the way up against the house. I'll go ahead and set a nail, put that on there and go to the other end.
Setting this reference chalk line is going to be a perfect guide to make sure that the end of my first board lands exactly where it should be and that it's perfectly square. With the reference line marked, we can install our first decking board right up against the house.
And you can see we're trying to keep the edge of that board right on that chalk line.
Where the edge of the first decking board meets the picture frame board, leave around 1/4 inch space to allow for expansion and contraction. And after confirming your board is exactly where it needs to be, use some of those color matched screws and attach that first board to the deck frame near the house with those color matched screws.
Now before we put in the next board, we got to install our hidden fastener system. I'm using the camo hidden fasteners. There's two types here. One is the wedge clip and the other is this guy.
And after using both of these and also a bunch of other kind of fasteners for the previous decks I've built, I can confidently say that the wedge clip is the best one by a mile. And all of these Lowe's products are going to be linked down in the video description. After placing a hidden fastener in the grooved edge of the board at every single joist, you can slide the next board into place and repeat the process of installing the hidden fasteners.
And after getting in about 4 rows or so, I'm gonna use these camo levers to pull everything in tight.
And I've built one composite deck without these levers, and I'm telling you, they are a game changer. With the first few boards in, it's time to secure them.
Now, when it comes to screwing the hidden fasteners to the joists, we have a couple different options. Option 1 is the hunt and peck method. This is like my dad typing. You're gonna look for each key or screw individually, and then when you find one, you're gonna take your drill and you're gonna screw it in. And yeah, super inefficient, but it does get the job done. Hunt and peck method. Sorry, Dad. The next method is the hunt and peck method with this guide here. This is gonna fit right over top of the screw, and it's gonna allow you to get your drill bit onto the screw much faster than simply hunting and pecking. So camo makes this guide. This is a little bit better, but the problem with both of these methods is you're kind of bent over, you know, screwing in, and after a while, that can hurt your back. Oh. Now the third and the best method is this camo clip drive. Now for this method, you're gonna take any old drill and you're gonna attach it to the top of the clip drive. Now when we push in like this, that's gonna cause a T15 bit to shoot out the bottom here. Then when I pull the trigger on the drill,
that bit is gonna come out the bottom and start spinning. There's also a guide, so it's gonna find its way onto the top of the screw every time.
All right, this is gonna be one entire row in real time. What was that, like 10 seconds? One other important item is you want to make sure that you adjust the torque on your drill appropriately so you don't over tighten the screws.
Because my deck is so large, I'm going to be using the stand-up clip drive system, but I built 2 decks prior to this without it. So if it's your first deck and it's a little bit smaller, feel free to save the money and just go with one of the first 2 methods, but this is a huge time saver.
All right, now that we got the first couple rows in, we'll just keep repeating that process over and over again, basically 4 boards at a time.
I was able to fly through the installation on this first row of boards here, except for the notches I had to cut around these 6x6s. Overall, not too complicated, but it did slow me down just a bit. And I've gotten quite a few questions from my neighbors as to why I've left these super tall 6x6s right down the center of my deck. But that is going to be for a future video that I'm actually pretty excited about, so consider subscribing if you want to see that one. And although the wedge clips and all the camo fancy tools are going to make this as efficient as possible, this process of laying composite boards still takes a while and it's a bit cumbersome. So put on a good podcast and buckle up.
Now the fact that I don't have to bend down to tighten all these is incredible. And I found that leaving the last board unfastened makes it easier to put the next one in place, so I haven't been tightening the last row.
And what I mean by that is if you tighten down the last row, it kind of pushes the board down on one side and elevates the other side. So it's just hard to get the next row of wedge clips and the next board to nest properly. And I continued installing the first row of boards until I got to my first corner. I'm gonna place the last board, which is also our picture frame board, and then I'm gonna mark where it ends on the joist. But because we're gonna be installing a 1.5 inch rim joist and I want a 1 inch overhang for the picture frame, I'm actually gonna cut 2.5 inches in from where I marked. After cutting the joists off, I'm gonna install that 1.5 inch rim joist with a few screws, and at that point it's time to take off that first picture frame board and start cutting my 45-degree miters so that I have a perfect connection where those 2 picture frame boards come together. Take your time with these cuts and try to make sure that you have a uniform spacing between your picture frame and all the other boards. And then I'm gonna partially screw everything in to hold it in place, but I'm gonna have to take it off later on to correct any miters or to make some cuts. That's why I don't sink the screws all the way. This is just to preliminarily hold it in while I get everything figured out. Be sure that you're maintaining that 1 inch or at least a consistent overhang on all your picture frame boards. And once I have that tacked in place, I'm going to install the rest of these boards. And this iterative picture frame approach where I tack it in place and then take it off and cut the 45, and also the process of leaving the joist long, it's just my method. You can use it or reject it, whatever you want. And after making it to the second corner of what I'm calling death row, we're gonna repeat the process. Mark the end and then come in 2.5 inches to account for the rim joist that we're gonna install, cut those off to size, and then retreat your cut ends before attaching the rim joist. Then we're gonna cut our composite decking at a 45-degree miter, test fit everything to make sure that it's perfectly tight in the corners, and then we're gonna attach them with some of those color match screws. And if you're wondering why I went with this ridiculous geometry with all these corners, I thought it would look cool to have a cutout for the stairs, but after building it and cutting all these miters, shoot, I should have just built one big rectangle.
Okay, so now that we have our first row of boards in for this first section, it's time to install the breaker board. So the breaker board is going to go right in this location. You can see that we have the support underneath it, and basically this is going to give us a similar edge to this over here in the middle of the deck. But before we can put this in, we've got to mark the line and make sure that we are perfectly plumb and at a right angle. You can use the 3-4-5 method for this. You can use a laser level like I like to do, or you can take a 6-foot level, but this is a very important, very expensive cut. You want to make sure that you get this line perfectly correct. Now, if you have stones of steel and a super steady hand, you can just snap a chalk line and run a circular saw along your line. I have neither of those things, so I'm going to use a Trex saw.
But whether you decide to use a track saw or a circular saw, you want to make sure that you adjust the blade depth so that it doesn't go past the boards. The last thing you want to do is have your blade be too deep and be cutting into your waterproofing and your blocking and framing below. Transparently, this was my first time using a track saw, so wanted to work out the kinks on this first cut, and I'll run you through some more details on making a cut with a track saw on the next track saw cut. And as you can see, the blade depth was perfect, so I was able to cut through the boards without damaging or cutting into the waterproofing. One last thing to note, when you make your breaker board cut, leave at least an inch on either side so that you can support the 2 rows of boards that are going to butt up into the breaker board.
Now you can see that we weren't able to bring the track saw all the way up to the house, so I'm going to take this metal sign and try to get it underneath the boards here. And that way, when I use my oscillating tool to cut these last little segments,
I won't accidentally cut too deep and cut into my waterproofing. The more we preserve the waterproofing now, the longer the deck's gonna last later. And cutting this last board was a little bit tricky because it was under the door threshold, but eventually I was able to cut it out. And I had to loosen the screws on the decking boards to fit that sign in, so I just tightened that back up. And finally, blow away any of the debris from your cuts.
Okay, so I think that cut went pretty well. Let's put in this breaker board and actually find out. Okay, I think that actually turned out pretty good. Okay, so I'm gonna use this sign as a spacer here because it's a little bit thinner than the typical spacer, so I think that'll give us enough room for expansion, but also make it look a little bit tighter. So let's go ahead and secure this in place. Now, the only butt joint we're gonna have on this entire deck is gonna be right here,
where those 2 breaker boards meet. Not ideal, but we'll live with it.
All right, it is time to put in the first board of the second section. Okay, I wanna make sure that we're perfectly in line right here, and then I have my mark from earlier, and we'll make sure that this board is positioned right at that chalk line, and then we're even here, and then we'll go ahead and secure it.
And while I secure the first couple boards in this second row, I want to get your guys' opinion on the 4-year degree. This sign right here I got during my time at the University of Maryland getting my bachelor's degree, and at that time, that's what everyone was doing. They were going to school for 4 years, trying to get good grades with the hopes that they would get a job and be able to make a decent living. But with information being more accessible now than ever, I feel like as a society, we've stopped valuing education, but instead we now value competence. And for better or worse, that competence usually can be found free online with a little bit of hard work and determination to learn it. So I'm gonna hop off the soapbox here, and I certainly don't have the answer, but would love to hear from you guys if you think the 4-year degree still has its place, or if it's just a 6-figure piece of paper that really doesn't hold much weight anymore. It's a controversial topic, but I'd be curious to get your insights. And bonus points to anybody who can guess what my degree is in from the University of Maryland. Go Dogs. And as one final recap, you're gonna put the wedge clips in the grooved edge of the board above each joist. After putting in the wedge clips, take the next groove board and push it in so that the wedge clip is nested between the grooves in both boards. Next, attach the camo levers to the joists and use the leverage to pull all the boards in tight. Then, screw everything down using whatever method you chose.
Okay, by now you get the process. Let's speed things up.
Nice.
So I almost forgot about this, but at some point in the future, I think I'm gonna do some kind of like enclosed patio somewhere over here because the mosquitoes are so bad. There, literally as we speak. So I figured if I'm gonna do something enclosed, that I should probably put some kind of screen up so that the mosquitoes can't come up from underneath in between the gaps in the decking board. So I guess here's the deal. If you see someone putting up a screen underneath their enclosed porch, one of 2 things is probably true. One, they're just a complete wuss when it comes to insects or mosquitoes, or the bugs are really bad. So I'll let you decide which category you think this falls into.
But after installing the rest of that row, it's time to cut the next spot for the breaker board. When it comes to marking the cut line, I'm gonna pull my tape measure from the outermost joist, which I know is perfectly square because I confirmed it during the framing stage. And if you missed my deck framing video, I'll link it down below. But I'm pulling an 11-foot offset from the outermost joist and marking it on both ends before snapping a chalk line. And if you run out of daylight, I'm telling you, I'm a huge fan of the laser level method to double check your work. With the chalk line marked, we're gonna position the track saw track so that the edge is right on top of that cut line. And a quick reminder to adjust the depth on your track saw so you don't cut too deep and cut through your framing and waterproofing. I put a little bit of duct tape on the back just in case, but that was probably unnecessary. And then it's just a matter of running your track saw down the track. And if you cut at a perfect depth, you should get a snap like this. That was a pretty good one, guys. I'm not gonna lie. That's 1/16 of an inch of composite board hanging on by a thread, just getting snapped. Not bad ASMR, if you ask me.
And you can see here that the depth was set perfectly. Nothing is cut, which is fantastic.
After blowing away all of the debris, it's time to set our final breaker board. And while I screw it in, let's talk about cost. The composite decking boards for this 700 square foot deck cost approximately $4,400. This equates to a cost per square foot of around $6.30 per square foot. I ran a calculation to see how much it would have cost to use 1x6 pressure treated decking boards for this same deck, and it would have been around $1,600. The cost per square foot is around $2.30. So for a standard deck, let's call it 16 foot by 16 foot, which is around 250 square feet, you'd be looking at around $1,600 for composite decking and $589 for pressure treated decking. So is that extra $1,000 worth all the time that you'd end up saving by not staining and resealing the regular wood deck? I don't know. That's a decision you'll have to make. And for these last few boards, I paid tribute to the 2 forgotten screwing methods.
Okay, so we left all of the boards here long. The last thing we have to do is cut a straight line here, and I'm gonna cut it about 4.5 inches away from the edge, because I have a 5.5 inch board, which I'm gonna place here, which is gonna complete the picture frame. So the edge is right here. I'm gonna go 4.5 inches over. I'll go ahead and mark that with the chalk line, and then we'll cut it. So right there is the edge of the deck. I'm gonna measure over 4.5 inches, right about here, and I'm gonna mark that with the chalk line. And this board right here is 5.5 inches. So basically when I place this on that 4.5 inch line, I'm gonna have a 1 inch overhang, which is exactly what I want.
So let's go ahead and snap this chalk line and make the final track saw cut. Now I got this track saw specifically for this project because if you make a mistake on this cut, that's like almost $1,000. So you better make sure you get it right. And we're at the home stretch here. Make sure you hang on to see how I finish the end of the deck. And just like with all the other cuts, the track saw doesn't allow you to go all the way up to the house. So I had to put in a little bit of metal protection underneath so I don't cut the waterproofing. And then I used an oscillating tool to cut out that final board there. I was very careful up against the ledger board to make sure I didn't cut anything. And for that reason, I usually had to use a screwdriver or something for that last little piece. After blowing out all the debris, it's time to put in the last piece of our picture frame. So at this point, everything shown in yellow and red is in place. Now we just have to do some cleanup work at the end of the deck right here. First, I'm gonna cut off this long breaker board so that it's even with my last row of decking boards. And you may have noticed that I didn't install the rim joist just yet, and here's why.
I like to leave my joists long until I get to the very last row. So this board right here is gonna be my last row of boards, and then I'm gonna have one more board that goes on the end, which is gonna complete my picture frame. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna position this board in place, and I'm gonna mark all of the joists so I know where this is gonna end.
I wanna mark both on the top and the sides of the joist where that last composite board is gonna be.
Okay, so this is the mark for the end of our last board. And because we have to attach the rim joist and I also want a 1 inch overhang, I created this jig here, which is 2.5 inches. So I'm gonna position that on my initial mark right here, and then I'm gonna mark the inside, and that way I know where to cut to get us exactly where we need to be. So this was the mark for the end of the board. This is where we're gonna cut because we're gonna have a 1.5 inch rim joist, and then I wanna have a 1 inch overhang with the board over the edge of the deck.
To make all these cuts, I'm using a circular saw, and I like to cut from up above. That way you're not really dealing with the dust in your face. With all of the joists cut to size, it's time to install the rim joist. And I like to hang up a little piece of blocking that I can use as a second set of hands to hold the rim joist in place so I can nail it to the end of the joist. And I explained this process as well as the entire process for framing a deck from start to finish in my last video, so check that out if you're interested. By starting the decking boards at the house and leaving your joists long, you take any guesswork out of the mix. You don't have to do any measuring, and you can ensure that you're gonna have a full board at the end of your deck.
Okay, it's getting dark, the rain is coming, my microphone has died, but I'm gonna finish this tonight.
So over here in the corner, I have the breaker board and the picture frame board left a little bit long. I'm gonna cut the breaker board on that line, and then I'm gonna miter the two intersecting picture frame boards at a 45-degree angle. Hit the corner with a few color match screws, and I'm still using that trusty sign as a 1/4 inch spacer. Now at the final corner here, I'm completing my last two 45-degree miters, and let's see how we did.
I think that's gonna be good enough.
After hitting that corner with a few more screws, this project is complete. Let's take a quick reminder look at where this project started, and here's a look at the final result. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like down below and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next video in my deck building series. Thanks again to Lowe's for sponsoring the video, and all the tools and materials are linked in the video description. In the next few videos, we're going to be installing a railing and replacing that ladder with an actual set of steps. Hope to see you there, and God bless.